To the poses, yes. So this is kind of a trick question. It's not um, any one pose in particular, but every single pose on the physical dimension, you could apply movement principle number one, right? Um, in Annie's system that she's created, she offers what she calls blueprint poses, right? Poses that lend themselves very well to exploring physically these conceptual ideas. For movement principle number one, she uses Tadasana. Tadasana, some of you may know as mountain pose. Mountain pose. And that simply looks like standing, right? And on the outside, right, externally, it could simply just look like standing, right? What would be the difference between somebody just standing there and somebody embodying Tadasana or mountain pose, right? So even that idea or approach and understanding begins to reveal a little bit more the deeper sense of the actual practice, right? Like somebody, what's the difference between, okay, I'm standing here, and then now I'm doing Tadasana, right? On the outside, nobody really knows. You can't really tell. You wouldn't be able to tell between somebody standing in the line, right? This person's standing a certain way, and this person is doing Tadasana. And so this is the aspect of the practice that makes it very personal, right? That there's this underlying commitment that you are creating within yourself, right? To be fully present in your body, and therefore also in this particular moment, right? That you are using your attention and awareness, or you're using your body to gather and focus your attention. Right? What else did I want to say about movement principle number one? Okay, so then that kind of, I wanted to go over last week's assignment about movement principle number one. Everybody did a pretty fantastic job answering the questions, just so that we can bring a little bit of clarity to the physical assignment from last week. There are 5 particular segments, right? There's the clear ones, the neck, cervical spine, thoracic, which is the upper back. And with the thoracic, you can think of it as all the parts of your vertebrae on the spine that have ribs connected to them. Yeah. There's 12 of them on each side. And then you have the lumbar, so the space right underneath the last rib. And that last rib, keep in mind, is a floating rib, meaning that it doesn't attach to the front section or your sternum. Right? It's just kind of like dangling there. Oftentimes when you hear like boxers or people breaking the ribs, it's often that because it's not completely secure and stable and wrapping all the way around from the spine to this good solid bone known as the sternum right in the center, or your breastplate, right? And then immediately inferior to that or below that is the lumbar spine or your lower back, right? That has 5 vertebrae, and then you have below that the sacrum and the coccyx. For the purposes of this class, we'll just think of the sacrum and the coccyx as just one joint segment, right? But in reality, the sacrum is made up of 5 different bones and 4 in the coccyx. Right? But there's very little voluntary movement that you could do within those. And the spaces in between are just so compacted and in varying degrees fused together that it's, at least for the purposes of this class, we're just going to treat it as one contained section of the body. Okay, and then the next part of the question was, which directions do the curvatures move in? right? The anatomical terms is lordosis and kyphosis. Lordosis is at the neck, right? The cervical spine and the lumbar spine, which curve forward, right? Lower back curves forward, the neck curves forward. And then it's kyphosis, where the thoracic spine and the sacrum, right? They curve towards the back, right? So it's like this S. Um, when these segments are out of balance, it's called hyperlordosis or hyperkyphosis, right? So that looks like this in the neck, right? If you gotta tilt your neck back, slump forward shoulders, right? Hyperkyphosis. And then hyperlordosis in the lower back is if if you stand with your butt sticking out and your belly flopping forward. And then hyperkyphosis in the pelvis, right, or in the sacrum really, is when your lower back is rounded, right? So there's these imbalances front and back. So the root is lordosis, kyphosis, and then when there's an imbalance in any one of their natural curvatures, it's a hyper, right? When there is imbalance now coronally or side to side, right, on the coronal plane, that kind of looks like this, right? But that's one way to see it, right? The shoulders. There could also be imbalances in the pelvis side to side. Clear kind of external markers, and that's called scoliosis. Yay! I got that too. Right, so that's side to side imbalance. Primarily, at least with movement principle number one, we're going to be working on the sagittal plane or the front and back plane. We'll talk a little bit more about anatomical direction starting next week, but on the sagittal plane, for the purposes of today's lecture, the movement that's possible on this kind of forward and back plane is flexion, right, and extension. Right, so flexion would be here. This is like a hyperflexion of all the segments of my spine, and then extension. Right? So flex and extend. Conceptually, it's the same here in the joint of your elbow. Right, it's a hinge. You can flex at this joint, and you can extend at that joint. Right, so flexion and extension. But in movement principle number one, we're thinking and feeling that along the spine, right, on the front and back, forward and back plane. And then to clarify, the cues that I was looking for one of the questions on that assignment was, what are some of the physical cues for movement principle number one? The general idea is, right, the simple straight answer is push the back of your body into the front of your body. Right? If I do that too much, then I become imbalanced that way. Push the front of your body into the back of your body. If I do that too much, then I'm rounded this way, right? But if you do both equally, right? For some, maybe you need to push the back to the front a little bit more. For others, maybe you got to push the front into the back. But when you do that together, you come and find kind of that center, right? And it's really our game, right? Our game and our journey to first kind of figure out like, okay, my tendency is to kind of slouch like this. Then my work is to push the back into my front, right? Other people who tends to sit with their hips thrust back, right? Maybe a little bit of pressure in the lower back, and there's no support on the front side. Maybe that person's work for that day is to push their belly into their back, right? But wherever you are in your body, you gotta kind of first locate, right? Where do I hold my head like this very often, right? Like this. How do I do that? So that's the general kind of suggestion. The more specific actions are to press your top thighs back, right? And when we were doing that, we've done that before lying down. We've done it up against the wall. And to press the top thighs back, it'll begin to push the butt back, right? So then the return to center would be to take your tailbone and then push it straight down. If you do that too much, then your hips will start to thrust forward, right? So again, push the front into the back, press the back into the front. And then now from here, the thoracic area, right, is to bring the shoulder blades and squeeze them together. You'll find the inferior tips of your shoulder blades beginning to squeeze together, and then it's going to start to push forward, right? If you do that too much, then that's also going to begin to create some tension and minimize and crunch the lower back, right? So then from there, you're going to take your front ribs and push it into the back. You can take that too far, right? And then it starts to round. Then you just kind of calibrate and figure out where is that middle for you. Now, when it comes to the neck, the action is to lift the collarbone, right? If you begin to lift your collarbone, your head is going to start to tilt back, right? To balance that out, I'm going to take the back of my head and then lift it straight up, right? So if I do this too much, I'm going to start to lean back. And then if I take the back of my head and lift it up till it can't go anymore, it'll start to tilt down, right? So there's this action of lifting the collarbone and then lifting the back of your neck. And in every pose, we're going to kind of keep that idea and question in our mind, like, what did I do that brought me away from this feeling, right? From this connection and embodiment of my center, right? So like, even if I'm sitting like this, I can still organize my spine, right? I have my leg out here, I can still sit and figure out what does this do to my hips and how does that change what's happening in my pelvis? And then how does that force me to sit in my spine? Can I be here comfortably, right? Even when I begin to bring my arms. Sometimes here's a very clear one. Good example is if there's tightness in the chest or something going on in the upper traps, and a lot of people can only bring their arms up this far. And then the spine starts to move and they're like, oh yeah, sure, I have my arms all the way up. But then if I organize my spine, really my arms are only out here, right? In order for me to really, truly bring my arms up over my head, I have to organize the rest of the spine. So I push the tailbone down, draw the thighs back, squeeze the shoulder blades together, push the bottom ribs, lift the collar, lift the back of my head. Because then otherwise, it's really more like out here. Before other parts of the body start to compensate. Right? So if you can kind of really tell here, my arms look like they're up over my head, right? But I'm in really big extension. I'm in hyperextension in my spine. If I straighten my spine out, really the arms are only kind of out this far. Okay? So we'll start moving it. We'll start moving around, and we're going to take that idea and kind of feel it in different positions. Right? What does that mean? Being in different positions. So Tadasana, right? So that is the pose. If you've ever studied anatomy and stuff like that, it's often referred to as anatomical center, yeah? Or dance or anything like that. Any kind of movement arts, there's always a starting point, right? Because it helps us get a sense of like, you know, in order to get to one place, we got to figure out first where we're starting from, right? And from this position, we begin to establish a language of like, okay, if I move my arm this way, this is abduction, right? And it's all kind of relative, right? This is kind of the fixed starting point from which everything can kind of be described, described from that point.